A couple of years ago, I took some time off to try to hike a 500-mile section of the Appalachian Trail, starting out near Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. As you walk along, there's a natural grapevine that forms among all the other hikers. And just 3 days into my trip, word came down the line that some hiker up near Waynesboro had been attacked by a black bear on the trail, which is actually an extremely rare occurrence. The details were sketchy, but the word was that he was right back on the AT already after being treated for his injuries. I became a little bit obsessed with this when I started out the next morning. I was doing 15 or 16 miles a day all alone on the trail. Sometimes a whole day would go by, you wouldn't see any other humans. And if you start to get paranoid like that, every twig, every shifting in the underbrush sounds like something threatening, and it can drive you crazy. Just 4 days later, I arrived at a shelter somewhere near Shippensburg, and there was kind of a buzz among the southbound hikers who were stopping for the night. A guy started to tell me the story of a northbound hiker who'd been attacked by a black bear, but the details were all wrong. And I realized he was talking about a separate incident. We went back and forth until it became obvious he was insisting the same hiker was involved. We got together with some other people at the shelter and went over the facts that some people knew. It seemed to be true, but impossible. The same hiker attacked twice within a week and injured both times. Most people adopt an informal trail name out there when they're going all the way to the end, and this guy referred to himself apparently as Claudius. The consensus among us was that he must have been doing something wrong, maybe even hunting, for this to happen. It just could not be. No one knew what happened to him after he walked out of the woods to the hospital in Boiling Springs. The area was filled with bears, but they were generally docile, afraid of humans, so what was the story? When Sunday came around, I was up around that area. I made the mistake of pushing past one shelter to try to make it to one further along, and when dusk fell, I was still on the trail, which was an unsettling feeling. I had a headlamp, but I didn't want to be out there so late. By the time I finally got to the next shelter, I was on my last legs, and it was almost full dark. I came around the front of it. These things were just 3 walls and a roof. And a man was sitting with his legs over the edge of the sleeping platform, drinking water slowly from a jug. He had a shaved head, was kind of muscular, looked maybe 50. I sat down on the other side of the platform and we said hello, and I started in with the usual polite queries. Are you going all the way through? What's your hike been like? He'd gotten a late start in the season, so he was headed to Maine from the Shenandoahs. He said his name was Claudius. Of course it was, because on the left side of his face were a dozen big, ugly stitches going all the way down his cheek, under his jaw. And his right elbow was wrapped in several layers of gauze as if protecting some injury. I had to inquire about the obvious. He spoke very softly and almost serenely. He confirmed that yes, less than 2 weeks into his hike, he had been attacked not once, but twice. The first time he had accidentally surprised a bear behind a rock, a fluke thing, and it had reacted badly, and so had he. It had stepped on his arm and clawed at his foot before he made enough noise to scare it enough for a retreat. And then a few days ago came the inexplicable nighttime attack. There had been a bear crouching near a spring just past dusk, and Claudius had gone into a kind of shock, forgot to make noise, forgot not to make eye contact, and it had charged. Again, deeply strange behavior. That time nothing seemed to scare the bear, and he believed he had been very close to being fatally mauled, until he lashed out just so with one of his hiking poles and gotten the bear in the eye. He said you could probably still see the blood if you went that way. He said it with no drama, no special emphasis, just looking out into the dark woods as if expecting to see something there. I tried to lighten the mood by asking him what he did for a living, and he smiled a strange smile and said he'd been piecing an existence together for a few years, but then nothing had seemed to work, and he figured the trail was a place he could go where his string of bad luck couldn't find him. Now he was thinking that it was out of control, that he was caught in a whirlpool of it. That's how he phrased it. No way out of the whirlpool. He'd been up for 44 years, he said, but for the last 2 it had been down, down, down. He just sort of trailed off, smiling. He said, "It's really kind of funny." I wasn't laughing. Jesus. He said, "Look at this." And he unzipped his pack and he brought out an undersized playing card and he showed it to me. He said, "Do you know the tarot?" I did, actually, a little bit. He was showing me the Tower, which in itself doesn't necessarily mean anything bad. But he said it had come up for him in a certain spot 3 times in a row just before he'd started his hike. I said, "How about trying it again now?" And he smiled sadly again and said, "Didn't want to bring the cards, it adds weight." But he'd kept the Tower, like an omen. He said he liked to laugh out loud a lot as he walked along, that there was a lot of humor in a situation that took some time to appreciate. I wished other hikers would come along to the shelter. I wasn't crazy about being alone with him. But he stood up and said he was going to walk through the night again, to make up some miles. Yet he didn't put on a headlamp. We shook hands and off he went. A half hour later, another hiker showed up at the shelter, and then 2 more. The next day was drizzly and a little misty. I was going to push myself to try to make it to the next town and take a 0 day there. Even a little rain and the sounds deep in the forest become mysterious, incredibly peaceful on the one hand, but that day, not so much. I kept my head down and trudged along, walked and walked. At one point, I smelled something very sharp, and I froze, trying to listen hard. I looked back at the way I'd come, having a sense that something was there. I waited, must have been 5 minutes, getting more and more tense. And the whole day was like that. I felt unwelcome out there, which is something I'd never felt before, and I was ashamed at letting my imagination run away like that. I began to obsessively check my map around 6 because it seemed like I should be farther along than I was. It seemed like I was already starting to lose the light because of all the cloud cover. By 7:15 it felt like full dusk had already set, and I still had 1.5 miles to go. I had expected a couple of rock scrambles here and there, and here came one, just when I was at my most exhausted. I packed away my hiking poles, and I balanced myself carefully on the slick rocks, crouching low as I maneuvered. I came up to a natural cairn, taller than I was. I took my backpack off, and I tossed it up and over the blind spot and got to work climbing up. When I pushed my head over, a jolt of shock went through me, as I realized I'd thrown my backpack onto someone who was lying on the top of the rock, face up in the light rain. At first I thought they must be sleeping, but they hadn't awoken when my pack hit their legs. And I immediately knew Claudius was dead. Even before I saw his face, I saw his right leg. Below his knee for 12 inches, the skin was puffy, red and black and gray, mottled and dead, and a pair of puncture marks stood out. Rattlesnake bite. It usually took hours to die, but maybe it had loaded him with all the venom it had. But his face was the thing that ended my planned 500-mile hike that very day. When I got to town to report what I'd found, that was it. I never went back into the woods. Claudius's eyes were wide open, and it looked like he died not just grinning, but almost laughing, his mouth locked that way, as if the end of his disastrous 1 in a trillion run of bad luck had amused him to no end in the darkest way imaginable. And if you look at the statistics and how unlikely his fate truly was, maybe he was right to die laughing. The whirlpool, as he'd called it, which we all later learned had claimed his job, most of his hearing, and the lives of his brother and mother, all since the previous May, had pulled him all the way down. The tower had won.